You may be seated. State, do you have any opening statements?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Please support. Counsel. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to take you back to April 23rd, 2017, when Lucy Salvador woke up that morning. She did not realize it was going to be the last day she talked to her son, Mark Salvador, or saw him alive. She spoke to him that day in the afternoon at the house, and Mark was excited. He had a rapper that contacted him about doing a photo shoot. Taymor McIntyre, or Tay-K 47, or Tay-K, here in San Antonio, Texas. He was excited. His passion was photography. His passion was taking photographs and wanted to make that his career. He was young. He was just 20 years old. Taymor McIntyre was almost 17 years old. He was an up-and-coming rapper that contacted Mark about this photo shoot. And when Taymor came over to pick up Mark from his house, at his mother's house, Mark went outside with his backpack and his camera, very definable white type camera, ran off to this car down the street, a black Kia. Little did he know he was getting into that car, and then we'd be falling off that car later on, shot by this individual that's sitting right over there. When he got to that car, he got in the back passenger seat. It's a four-door Kia. Taymor McIntyre was in the front passenger seat. Joanna Reyes was driving the vehicle. A good buddy of Tay-K's was in the back seat and scooted over to the middle, Jalen Bell. And then also there was a Jeremiah Rodriguez in the back seat. When they drove away, they proceeded over to 410 and McCullough, across the street from North Star Mall here in San Antonio, Texas. When they were at the intersection, an altercation began at that point. This man right over here pulled out a gun and turned around and started hitting with fist and also with the gun, telling him, "Give me your stuff, give me your stuff, give me that backpack." They're wrestling for the backpack. At that point, Jalen Bell also wants to get involved in this. He's a bigger guy, a lot bigger than Tay-K. He's in that back seat with Mark. They start beating him and trying to take away his backpack. His passion is in that backpack. His photography, his career. Tay-K gets that backpack away from him. Jalen Bell is still hitting and kicking and pushing Mark. They're at a stoplight. There are people parked around them at that stoplight, witnessing what's going on. Because this happened at 5 o'clock on a Sunday, in broad daylight. At some point, Mark gets kicked out of the car. They slam that back door. They won't let him back in the car. "Help! Help! Help!" He's yelling. What he loved is in that car, his camera. "Give me my things! Give me my things!" He knows the light's about to turn green. He's frantic. He runs to the front. He jumps on the hood. One of the biggest mistakes of his life, or rather, the last part of his life. Joanna Reyes is driving that vehicle. The light turns green. They drive through that stoplight. It's a Sunday afternoon. Right across the street or highway from the North Star Mall, there's a Chick-fil-A. Chick-fil-A is closed on Sundays. They pull into that Chick-fil-A parking lot. She slams on the brakes. Mark sort of stands up. Looks like he's stomping on the windshield. But then that car jerks and he falls. You'll see that passenger door open up, the front passenger door open up, where this man over here was sitting with that gun. He leans out. He shoots Mark through the shoulder, goes across his body, exits out of a little bit out of his lower back. He falls to the ground. The car reverses and takes off from the scene. You'll see several people run up and try to help Mark. But that bullet crossed his body. It hit his spine, hit both lungs. If he would have been on the best medical gurney in the world, he wouldn't have survived that shot. He dies in that parking lot that day. As Tay-K and his friends drive off. They don't go to the cops. They don't call the cops. They run away. But that's not the end of the story. Because that car was found less than a mile away, abandoned, at a Mexican food restaurant. There's evidence there that Tay-K was there, that Jalen Bell was there, that Jeremiah Rodriguez was there, and Joanna Reyes was there. Doesn't end there. Tay-K and Jalen take off. They run. They get out of town. Jalen is caught in Dallas. Taymor is caught in New Jersey. Nobody called the cops. Nobody said anything at that point of helping Mark Salvador. A promising career, possibly photography, a difficult field of photography. You take chances, you do things for nothing. That's what he wanted. He had a chance that day to take some photographs of an up-and-coming rapper that had his career on the horizon, possibly, or wanted it to be that career of a rapper. But instead, that particular day, he chose to take a life of an individual, Mark Salvador. That's what we will bring to you, and evidence will show that Taymor McIntyre committed capital murder on April 23rd, 2017. Thank you.
Just one moment. All right, you may proceed.
May it please the court, opposing counsel, ladies and gentlemen. Assumptions and the general guesswork that is attendant to the story that the prosecution just laid out for you should be of deep and troubling concern. There's no dispute that Mark was killed. There's no dispute that he was shot. There's no dispute that there was an altercation in that car. But virtually everything else that the prosecution has laid out for you is going to be told to you through either people who are making a wild guess based upon very, very small fragments of information, the bystanders, for example, on the highway, on the access road where this altercation took place. Or it's going to come from people who were in the car. And I want us to stop and consider what that really means in a case like this. Mr. McIntyre is accused of capital murder. You heard yesterday extensive discussion about something called the law of parties, which is the idea that if you are assisting someone in the commission of a crime, either before it happens, while it's going on, or after the fact, you are culpable just the same as the individual who pulled the trigger, the individual who decided to take a life. That's going to be the backbone of this case, is everybody in that car pointing their finger at someone other than themselves. And the state paid to get that information developed. Not with money, not with a normal kind of a transaction, but with something that is the most valuable thing a person can trade with, their freedom. That's the issue in this case. What exactly caused there to be a fight in this car and who that fight was with is all going to come from people that were occupants of the vehicle and, according to the state's theory of this, participants in what took place. As far as who struck first, what the argument was about, all of that's going to come from the other occupants of that vehicle who have a vested interest in making sure that it doesn't land back on them. The facts and circumstances about where people are seated, who fired the gun, why the gun was fired, all of those are similarly going to come from people with a vested interest in making sure that it doesn't come back on them. And ultimately, all of those things tied together, the way in which this case becomes a charged capital murder against Taymor McIntyre has been spun from the detective's lips to these witnesses' ears and about to be regurgitated back to you just the way the state wanted it, the state paid for it, and the state packaged it. That should be taken with an exceptional amount of scrutiny. And the law in Texas acknowledges that. I expect, after you've heard all the evidence in this case, that you will be charged on something called the accomplice witness rule, which tells you that in Texas, the law requires that the state provide corroborative evidence other than the testimony of an accomplice or a co-conspirator in order to establish guilt. And it is not alone sufficient to convict that corroborative evidence simply prove that a crime occurred. And what the state's going to try and do, I anticipate, is to stack accomplice on top of accomplice on top of accomplice to try and convince you all that that's sufficient to corroborate the offense. Don't let them do it. That's not how the law works. And you all would have to take each of those accomplices as being inherently suspect and recognize that they can't corroborate each other. And what we're left with at the end of that is going to be the actions of law enforcement investigating this case, which, as my colleague Mr. Goldstein will explain to you in a moment, were subpar, suboptimal, and not acceptable, especially when we have this kind of a case on the line. The investigation done here was half-hearted, lazy, negligent, dilatory, and ultimately was substituted by reliance on these accomplices as the proof in the pudding, as it were, that a crime was committed. You're also going to hear some evidence about the aspect of the case Mr. Garrahan described to you, which is that Mr. Saldivar got on the hood of the car after some altercation took place in the vehicle. That is to say, there will be people that testify who were just on the roadside that in broad daylight on a Sunday, there was some kind of an altercation in that car. Accounts will differ. Some people describe the individual as an African-American man, young. Some will describe that individual as having a pistol. Some didn't see one. Some will describe that individual as being a Hispanic young man. Some will say that the Hispanic young man had a gun. Some don't. All of those things, I think we have to understand, just are what they are. This happened in the flash of an eye. It happened in a place where you don't normally expect to see something like that. We're talking about Chick-fil-A over on the north side of town across from North Star Mall. Not your normal 5 o'clock Sunday activity. And what they saw is what little piece of this overall story they saw. But what seems to be consistently accepted, at least by the lead detective on the case at the end, as he synthesizes all of these little snippets of observation, is that Mark Anthony Saldivar got out of the vehicle, proceeded to argue with the occupants of the vehicle while inside, they're still inside, and then jumped onto the hood of the car and began stomping the windshield of that car. And you'll see the windshield of that car caved in as the result of that activity. You can see where his foot came through, and you can see the rest of it coming through with it. And it is in that context that gunshots are fired. It is in that context that Mr. Saldivar loses his life. We talked yesterday about self-defense. We talked about defensive property. We talked about provoking the difficulty. So fundamentally, I want you to keep those principles in the back of your head, because however these cooperators, these accomplices, decide to paint and shade this version of the story on this occasion, and there have been several. The bottom line is that the things that happened while everyone was in that car had dissipated. And I think a great many of us, confronted with an altercation inside of a vehicle like that, would have walked away. But that's not what happened here. Now, the state's going to try and maintain that the reason why Mark Anthony Saldivar didn't walk away is because his camera equipment was inside. But you'll hear testimony from one of the cooperating co-defendants, one of the accomplices, that the photo shoot that he just described had been called off, and that they were just giving this guy a ride. Any evidence that you do hear about a camera, about a backpack, about property of Mr. Saldivar being taken is going to come from these cooperators. There's no camera recovered in this case. There's not going to be an Exhibit 15, the camera of the deceased. You're not going to see money taken out of the deceased's wallet. The fact that those objects even exist is something that has to be speculated and guessed upon, and then ultimately the only place you're going to hear it as evidence is from these accomplices. So fundamentally, the state can't prove that this was not a justified homicide. The state cannot prove that Mr. McIntyre was the shooter in this controversy. The state can't prove that there was a robbery, either intended or executed or attempted. Those things are all coming from people with an absolute vested interest to accomplish it. And so, no matter how the charge is broken up for you, I think that there is no question that the state will not be able to meet its burden to establish proof beyond a reasonable doubt of capital murder, and far less question that they'll be able to establish even basic, fundamental first-degree murder. Those are the things that you all are confronted with. I'm going to turn it over now for just a moment to Mr. Goldstein, who's specifically going to talk to you a little bit more about the nature of the investigation in this case, and fundamentally why, as jurors, as you are assessing the evidence in light of your duty to presume Mr. McIntyre innocent, that the investigation in this case should be criticized, and you all should not be filling in the gaps for the police. I want to thank you all for your time, and I urge you to listen to the evidence carefully. I know you will reach the correct verdict.
May it please the court, able counsel, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, it's the next one?
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is old. The evidence is old. It occurred in 2017, 7 years ago. Speaking of old, I'm 81. I'm probably the oldest person in this room, and that's why I need notes and why counsel come over and coddle me every once in a while. I've been sitting here listening to the able lawyers in this room speak to you. That's primarily going to be my job. I haven't said much to y'all or anyone up until this time, and I'm probably not going to say a lot during the trial. I'm going to be like y'all. I'm going to be watching it. I do think it's important that you understand that while you're listening to the evidence, that these are good lawyers on the other side. Just as I know ours are very capable lawyers. I respect them. I respect this court. I respect our judicial system. 2.5 centuries. I mean, it goes back to ancient time. There's some magic in the number 12 when you listen to evidence. And I think almost every lawyer that's done this, I've been doing it 57 years, will agree. You come to the right result. I'm always, each one of y'all might not use the same tools, each one of y'all might not come from the same place, each one of you bring your own experience to this room. It must be your individual decision, guilt or innocence. You should deliberate, you should listen to the other jurors when that time comes at the end of this case. But it has to be your individual decision. Let me suggest to you that this adversary process involves a lot of things. As we listen to this evidence, there's going to be disputed evidence. You're going to hear two different sides. That's why we have jurors. You're going to have to make some decisions. Most of the evidence in this case is not in dispute. Most of it's not going to be contested. And you might think, well, why am I being subjected to all this? That's their job. Their job is to prove, if they can, each and every element of this offense beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the highest standard known to law. They will be, and they're going to be doing their job, and they have to prove each element, and therefore, don't think they're trying to bore you. That's their job. They have to prove it all up. So you're going to be listening to that evidence as we talk about evidence in this case. They get to go first and last, if you've noticed. There's a reason for that. They have that heavy burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt. Therefore, we give them the chance to open and, at the end of the case, to close. They'll be the last you will hear from. The last evidence, the last argument. And that's as it should be. But we're kind of squeezed in the middle like a ham sandwich. I'm Jewish, so maybe it wouldn't be a ham sandwich, but it'll be a sandwich nevertheless. Let's say turkey sandwich. Some people have described me that way. There are some matters that are in dispute. And I want to warn you in advance, each side will vigorously present their evidence. There'll be objections. We may have disputes. We may offend each other on occasion. I hope not. I believe in the collegiality of fellow lawyers. Like I said, I respect these. But we're going to have some disputes. I may offend them from time to time. I may offend the judge on occasion. I may, God forbid, offend one of y'all. My hope is that if the lawyers should perchance offend you on occasion, hold that against the lawyers. Hold that against me. Tell me about it after this case is over with. Don't hold that against Taymor McIntyre, Tay-K. Please. That's not how our system works. Let's talk about the matters in dispute. Now we'll do that briefly, Your Honor. Taymor McIntyre is charged with capital murder. And as you heard, what they've alleged is this was a murder committed during the course of a robbery or attempted robbery. But that extra part is when you heard all the questions being asked of you during jury selection. Everybody paid a lot of attention. It was because that's what's required to prove that offense. You have to prove both murder and that it was during the course of a robbery. And that's going to be an issue in the case. But let's talk about one of the disputed issues, the murder, the shooting. It is interesting in this case, what you will find is that there was only one spent shell casing found in the car. The black Kia that was owned by the state's key witness. That spent shell casing, when it was originally identified by the prosecution's technician, they identified it as a 40 millimeter shell. Later, another tech, or I'm not sure, but the technicians in the prosecutor's office, weeks, months later, re-examined the shell casing. Became important. And they decided it wasn't a 40 millimeter shell. It was a caliber shell, 40 caliber. It was a 9 millimeter shell. That casing, that spent shell casing, as most of you know, comes when you fire a projectile, a bullet, the shell casing remains behind. This one remained in the vehicle. 9 millimeter shell casing. While there was a mistake initially, that goes to all of our, when we watch all the AI and all the technical magic that we see on TV, mistakes are made. It may not be important in this case, but I think we can all agree now it's a 9 millimeter, not the 40 millimeter that they originally thought it was. That empty spent shell casing found in the black Kia that was located the night of April 23rd, 2017. So there was only one shell casing found. There was another bullet. I think it was a 350 caliber, 380. I've got my muzzle sniffer here to correct me. 380. That's not a derogatory comment. There was a 380 bullet, but it had not been fired. And that bullet was found in the seat where Taymor Tay-K allegedly was sitting that night. But the only spent shell casing, the only one that was fired, that's found in the black Kia that night, is a 9 millimeter spent shell casing. There was also only one weapon recovered in this case. It was a 9 millimeter Smith & Wesson, seized from the co-defendant that able counsel for the prosecution mentioned to you earlier, Jalen Bell. He had a 9 millimeter Smith & Wesson, the same caliber. It was months later when he was arrested in Dallas-Fort Worth area. But it was the same caliber, the one weapon that has been seized, as the one shell casing that was found. Now, you've got one shell casing, 9 millimeter, one weapon, 9 millimeter, a Smith & Wesson. And you would think that the evidence would show that they compared them. That weapon sat for 7 years in evidence rooms between Fort Worth and San Antonio. Years here in our own evidence vault. No one ever tested them. No one ever compared them until John Hunter. He kind of looks like Harry Potter, doesn't he? Well, no offense, John. He was one of my best students, and he worked for me for a long time, so I think I have the right to make fun of him. He makes fun of me too, and you'll probably hear about it. But here is the interesting part. No one ever compared them until he requested from this able prosecutor, who then located the weapon, and they had it tested by a technician, like the prosecution technician that mistook the 40 caliber that was actually a 9 millimeter. And he says that that weapon, that 9 millimeter spent shell casing, matched the weapon that had been sitting in evidence rooms for 7 years. You're going to hear, I believe, conflicting testimony. It's going to be brought to you, but it's not going to, we have to wait. Remember I told you, they get to go first and last, and we're kind of sandwiched. Well, the part of our sandwich is after their piece of bread that goes first. They get to go first. So please you know, it's like, you've all been to the movies and you see a trailer and you think, God, I'm going to like that movie, and you go see the movie and it's not nearly as good as the trailer. You think, I wasted, you know, when I was a kid here, I could go to the Majestic for 15 cents. It's a lot more expensive now, but even then I felt ripped off when I thought, geez, the only good part of that movie they showed me in the trailer. And I sat there for 2 hours, or however long. Well, I'm going to ask you to wait to hear this conflicting evidence. It's worth the wait, folks. This is a movie worth waiting for. Additionally, and kind of almost more importantly, is that the state, after 7 years, finally asked Jalen Bell, this co-defendant, about the 9mm weapon that he had. He said, oh no, that's not the weapon I had back in April of 2017. That was a different Smith & Wesson 9mm. Well, 7 years later, what are we supposed to do about that? Those are all interesting issues of evidence that I would suggest to you are questions that might cause you to have a doubt based upon reason. But that's your decision. When you make important decisions in your life, whether it's to buy an encyclopedia or a new car or a new house, you have to decide how to trust someone. And that's the next issue you're going to be confronted with. How do you decide whether you believe somebody or not? How do you? Well, we all have that instinctive. We look at people. We listen to them. We watch their demeanor. Are they the kind of person we want to believe? Will we buy an encyclopedia from them? Will we buy a car from them? We've made mistakes, all of us. In 81 years, I've made plenty of them. But I will tell you this. This is a time when you're going to have to make those decisions. And you look at the evidence, you look at the witness, and you have to make a decision. What would help you? What evidence would help you decide whether or not to believe someone? Well, is there something that corroborates it? They say they were in New Orleans on a particular day and they've got a plane ticket to New Orleans. They've got a hotel room at some hotel in the French Quarter. Well, that doesn't say they were there, but at least it corroborates it to some extent. You also want to know, why would somebody tell a story like that when you're looking at this evidence if it's not the truth? Well, wouldn't you want to know what they said before? Wouldn't you want to know if they were paid something for their testimony? That'd be important to me. I mean, people could get paid with money. People can get paid with something more valuable than money. Their life and liberty. You're going to see that the state's key witness was paid mightily with her liberty. She was promised something, and she got it for her testimony that met the prosecution's theory of this case. I can't promise anybody anything. I can't pay them. Not with money, not with their liberty. That would be a crime. How can we call a system fair that allows only one side to pay for what they call the truth? Well, that's what you're going to have here. You're going to have to decide whether this witness is believable. I want you to watch them. Excuse me. I'm old. I want you to watch them. See whether this is the kind of person who you want to put your trust in. And give some consideration to what they got paid for that testimony. What would they What would someone say if it would mean facing a capital murder case or walking free today when they come into this court? How much is that worth? Is that worth telling the story that meets the theory of the prosecution? We leave this case. That's all right. I was hoping that San Fernando's bells would be ringing, but I'll settle for the tinkling. We're going to leave this in your hands. We picked y'all both sides because we trust you. They say use your common sense, use it. Listen to the lawyers. We don't give you evidence. Our arguments are not evidence. But I think I'm going to listen to them, and I want them and you to listen to me and to John. John's going to have the heavy load in this case, as well he should. But I'm going to be watching it like y'all are. We trust you will come to the right decision. All I ask, as the old man in the room, is that the next morning after we finish this case, you can look in the mirror and say, I did right. You can look in the mirror and say, the life and liberty of this young man was worth holding the prosecution to their burden. That's important. That, beyond a reasonable doubt, the 12 members of this jury is a time-honored tradition in this country. It's what sets us apart from every other country in the world. I take pride in what I do, so do they. And I hope you will. And when it's all said and done, you can look in the mirror the next morning, the day after, and say, I did right. I did right to myself, my family, and to young Taymor. We can ask for nothing more. Thank you. Thank you.